Marcus had just clocked out from his late shift at the local convenience store and was eager to head home. The night air was cool, and the streets were calm as he walked down the familiar road that led to his apartment. His mind drifted back to the conversations he'd had with his coworkers about the difficulties of balancing work and life. But tonight it felt different. The neighborhood seemed quieter than usual, and the streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. He had always walked this route before without a second thought. The walk was routine and comforting, a brief escape from the constant pressures of life, working late shifts at a job that barely paid the bills, dealing with people who rarely acknowledged his presence. Yet he kept his head down and pressed on, hoping that things would get better. One day, as he passed the corner store, a police car slowly rolled up beside him. Marcus didn't think much of it at first. There were often police cars around patrolling the area late at night, but this one slowed down next to him and stayed there as if waiting for him to notice. The officer inside was watching him intently, and as the car stopped, Marcus could feel the heat of the officer's gaze, as if he were already being judged for something he hadn't even done yet. The car's window rolled down, and the officer spoke. "Hey, what are you doing out here so late?" The officer's voice was sharp, but Marcus didn't flinch. He had been stopped before for no reason, and was well aware of how these situations could unfold. He knew the drill. His hands stayed in his pockets, and he kept his tone steady as he replied, "I'm just heading home, officer." Nothing suspicious about that. The officer's eyes narrowed, as if Marcus had said something wrong. "You know it's pretty late for someone to be out walking by themselves, don't you?" Marcus wasn't sure what to make of the comment. He had walked these same streets for years now without issue. It was the same routine every night. Why was this time any different? He stood his ground and asked, "Is there a problem, officer?" "Because I'm just trying to get home." The officer hesitated for a moment, then replied, "You look suspicious walking around here at this hour. Are you sure you're not up to something?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but firm. "Suspicious how I walk down this street every day? I've got nothing to hide." The officer's expression hardened as he leaned forward, his hand resting on the door handle. "I'm gonna need you to step over here for a moment," the officer ordered. Marcus's heart began to race, but he kept his composure. He wasn't going to let himself be intimidated. "There's no need for that, officer. I'm just going home. I haven't done anything wrong." The officer ignored his words and swung the door open with a force that startled Marcus. "I said step over here." The officer's tone was sharper now, and Marcus could see the tension building in the officer's posture, his hand twitching near his belt. Marcus felt a rising anger inside him. He wasn't some criminal to be treated like this. He was just a man trying to make it through another day. "Why don't you just let me go home?" The officer didn't answer. Instead, he took a step toward Marcus, who took a step back instinctively. His eyes darted around, looking for any possible way to defuse the situation. But the officer was moving quickly now, grabbing Marcus's arm and jerking him toward the squad car. "What are you doing? Let go of me!" Marcus demanded, his voice shaking but full of defiance. The officer's grip tightened. "You're not going anywhere until I say so," the officer growled. Marcus felt his blood boil. How could this be happening again? Why did it always have to be like this? The moment his mouth opened to speak again was when everything changed. The words slipped out without thinking. "This is wrong. You have no right to do this." Marcus could feel the heat rising in his chest as the officer's grip tightened. The frustration, the anger, and the injustice he'd been carrying for so long surged within him. He wasn't going to let this man push him around any longer, not when he had every right to speak his mind. His muscles tensed as he took a step back, trying to break free from the officer's grasp. But the officer tightened his hold, not willing to let go. "What's your problem?" Marcus demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. His eyes locked with the officer's, refusing to look away, refusing to be intimidated. The officer's glare hardened, his lips curling into a snarl, but Marcus wasn't afraid anymore. He had seen this look too many times before, the look of someone who thought they were untouchable, above the rules. The crowd around them had begun to murmur. A few phones already pointed at the scene, capturing every moment. Marcus could hear their whispers, some in support of him, others uncertain, but all of them watching in silence. He could feel the eyes of the people pressing down on the officer, and it made him stand a little taller, made his resolve a little stronger. "You're out of line," Marcus said, his voice louder now, his words cutting through the air. He could feel his heart racing, adrenaline pumping through his veins, but he didn't let it show. He wasn't just standing up for himself. He was standing up for everyone who had ever been silenced or ignored. Everyone who had ever faced this kind of injustice and had been told to keep quiet. The officer didn't respond at first, but his grip remained firm. For a second, it felt like time had slowed. Marcus could see the officer's fingers twitching, his body stiff with anger. He could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on them both. The officer was waiting for something, an apology, an excuse, a sign of weakness. But Marcus wasn't going to give him that. "You don't get to treat me like this," Marcus continued, taking a step forward, pushing against the officer's hold, testing his strength. The officer's eyes flickered, just for a moment, a sign of uncertainty, but then he raised his hand, the tension in his body growing. He was ready to do whatever it took to maintain control, to prove that he had power over this situation. But Marcus wasn't backing down. His thoughts were clear now. This wasn't about survival, it was about dignity, and he would not let anyone take that from him. As the officer moved toward him, Marcus braced himself, his thoughts laser-focused, determined not to let fear cloud his judgment. The crowd's whispers grew louder, the phones recording every moment of this confrontation. It wasn't just Marcus and the officer anymore. This moment had become something bigger, something that everyone could see. And even though Marcus felt the sting of the officer's proximity, his pulse racing with fear, he knew one thing for certain: he would not be intimidated. The officer's arm swung toward Marcus then, the motion swift and violent. Time seemed to freeze as Marcus saw the punch coming, and before he could react, the officer's fist connected with his cheek with a sickening thud. The force of it sent Marcus stumbling back, his vision blurring for a moment as pain shot through his jaw. The crowd gasped, the murmurs of shock rising into shouts. But Marcus stayed on his feet. His hand went to his cheek, feeling the warmth of the blood trickling down. But he didn't flinch. He didn't fall. Instead, he stood taller, his eyes now burning with something far more dangerous than fear: defiance. The officer stood over him, breathing heavily, looking like he was preparing for the next strike. But Marcus wasn't giving him the satisfaction of a reaction. He wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand, his glare never leaving the officer's face. "You've made your move," Marcus said, his voice steady and calm, despite the whirlwind of emotions crashing through him. "Now, what are you going to do?" The officer hesitated, his body trembling just slightly. For a moment, Marcus thought he saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. The officer's hands clenched into fists again, his body tense as if he were trying to decide whether to escalate or back down. And as Marcus stood there, ready for whatever came next, he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let this officer get away with what he had done. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. The crowd was watching, their eyes locked on the unfolding drama, and Marcus wasn't about to let this moment slip away. Not when it felt like everything depended on it. The crowd around them began to grow as people gathered on the sidewalks, their phones out capturing every moment of the altercation. Marcus could hear the murmurs and whispers growing louder as his mind swirled with confusion and anger, the sting of the officer's punch still pulsing through his jaw. But he refused to show weakness. He wiped the blood from his mouth and stood tall, not giving the officer the satisfaction of seeing him falter. The officer's eyes darted around, as if searching for a way to regain control, but there was no turning back now. "What's going on here?" one voice shouted from the crowd. "Is he under arrest or something?" Another person yelled out. "What did he do?" The officer's grip on his belt tightened, as if readying himself to escalate things further. But Marcus could feel the pressure mounting on him. The people were watching, they were witnessing everything, and the officer knew it too. "I'm just trying to get home," Marcus called out, his voice steady despite the situation, his hands still held up as if in defense. But he was no longer backing away, he was standing his ground, and the officer knew he couldn't just push him around like he did before. Marcus could see the officer's frustration building as the words from the crowd swirled around them. "Let him go," one person shouted. "You can't just hit him like that," another voice called out. The officer's face reddened with rage, his eyes flicking back and forth between Marcus and the onlookers. He knew this wasn't going the way he planned. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He was supposed to be in control, but now the balance was tipping, and he wasn't sure how to stop it. The officer took a step closer to Marcus's chest, puffed out in an attempt to intimidate him. But Marcus wasn't scared anymore. The crowd was on his side now, and they weren't going to let the officer get away with what he'd done. Marcus squared his shoulders, his heart racing, but his voice was calm and unwavering. "You don't scare me," Marcus said, looking the officer directly in the eye, his tone carrying the weight of everything he had endured up until this point. The officer's lips curled into a snarl, as if he hadn't expected Marcus to stand up to him in such a way. He hadn't anticipated this level of resistance, and it was starting to eat away at his control. "Shut up," the officer snapped, his voice trembling with anger as he took another step toward Marcus. But this time Marcus didn't flinch, he didn't move, he just stood there waiting for whatever came next. The officer reached forward again, grabbing Marcus's arm, with more force this time, pulling him toward the squad car. "You're coming with me," the officer barked, his voice thick with authority. But Marcus didn't budge. He was done with being pushed around, done with being treated like he was beneath this man. He pulled his arm away and stood his ground again. "You can't take me anywhere without a reason," Marcus said, his voice louder. Now the crowd murmured in agreement. Some people stepped closer to him, others yelled for the officer to back off. But the officer didn't seem to care. He was already too far gone, his hands trembling with fury as he moved to grab Marcus once more. But Marcus wasn't going to let him this time. He took a step back and planted his feet firmly on the ground as if he was ready to face whatever came next. The officer's face was flushed with frustration and desperation, his hand now reaching for his baton, his eyes wild. But Marcus wasn't scared anymore. He wasn't going to back down. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" the officer spat, his words dripping with venom. His body language was that of someone who had completely lost control. But Marcus was done letting fear dictate his actions. He was done with being the target of someone else's anger and aggression. And in that moment he found a strength within himself he didn't know he had. The tension in the air was thick and palpable, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Marcus could feel his body still aching from the blow, but the pain was secondary now. His focus was on the officer standing before him, fists clenched and chest heaving. He knew the officer was waiting for him to make a move, to react to the violence, but Marcus wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Instead, he stood tall, his eyes unwavering, his body steady in the face of everything that had just happened. The officer's eyes flickered for a moment, and Marcus could see the doubt creeping into his expression, something that hadn't been there before. The rage had softened, replaced by hesitation. The officer's grip on his authority was slipping, the cracks in his composure more apparent with every passing second. He wasn't as sure of himself as he had been when he first approached Marcus. "What are you going to do now?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but cutting through the silence like a knife. His words were directed at the officer, but they felt like they were aimed at the entire system, at the structures that allowed this kind of abuse to happen without consequence. The officer didn't answer at first, his face still tense, his fists still raised, but his eyes told a different story. There was something there now, something Marcus couldn't ignore. Was it regret? Was it fear? The crowd, silent but watchful, seemed to feel it too. They were no longer just passive observers. They were witnesses to a moment of transformation. The officer was no longer just a figure of power and authority. He was a man, vulnerable in a way he hadn't been before. His anger, the thing that had driven him to lash out, was fading, and in its place was something Marcus couldn't quite name, something that made him feel, for the first time in a long while, like he might actually have a chance. The officer took a step back, his shoulders slumping slightly, his gaze shifting from Marcus to the people around them. The crowd was watching, their phones still recording, but there was something different about the way they were looking at the officer now. It wasn't just fear or suspicion anymore. There was something like understanding, as if they could see that the officer was at a crossroads. His choices were laid out before him. He could double down on his aggression, or he could step back and face the consequences of his actions. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The crowd, the officer, even Marcus. It was as if time had slowed, and all that mattered was the decision that would be made next. Marcus could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, could feel the eyes of the world on both him and the officer. This wasn't just about one interaction anymore. This was a turning point, a potential shift in how people were treated by those in power, a test of what could happen when someone finally decided to stand up. The officer took another shaky breath, and for the briefest moment, Marcus thought he might say something, anything to break the silence. But instead, the officer just stood there, looking lost. His fist dropped slightly, no longer raised in anger, but held loosely by his side. The tension in his shoulders seemed to soften, the rigid lines of his authority beginning to erode. Marcus didn't lower his gaze. He didn't step back. He didn't give the officer the chance to regain control. Instead, he held his ground, his voice steady but firm as he spoke again. "If you're sorry, then show it. Don't just stand there hoping I'll forget what you did. Don't just stand there pretending nothing happened." The officer's face reddened, his eyes darting from Marcus to the crowd. His jaw tightened, and Marcus could see the internal battle raging within him. The apology, the recognition of his mistake, was hanging in the air, but it wasn't enough to take away the weight of the punch. It wasn't enough to undo the hurt, the fear, the humiliation that Marcus had just endured. The crowd was still silent, their eyes fixed on the officer now, waiting for him to do something. Anything to either make things right or make them worse. They were watching, but it was no longer just about them. It was about what they were going to do with the power they had in that moment. Would they stand by, or would they demand accountability for what had just happened? The officer swallowed hard, his throat dry, and for a moment, it seemed like he might speak. But instead, he exhaled sharply, his body shaking slightly as if the weight of his actions had finally caught up to him. It was clear that something inside him had changed, but what that change meant, Marcus couldn't be sure. The officer wasn't the same man who had approached him with anger moments before. Now there was something else there, something Marcus wasn't sure how to read. But whatever it was, it didn't make the officer's actions right, and it wouldn't undo what had happened. Marcus stayed quiet, letting the officer wrestle with whatever emotions were swirling inside him. The world was watching. The moment was unfolding. And Marcus knew one thing for sure. He wasn't done here. Not by a long shot. Marcus stood still, feeling the rush of adrenaline course through his veins. The crowd around them was growing louder, now their voices rising as the officer faltered. His posture had changed from one of aggression to uncertainty, and Marcus knew that he couldn't let this moment slip away. The officer was still breathing heavily, his chest heaving, and for the first time since this began, he looked unsure of himself. Marcus could see the weight of his actions beginning to dawn on him, but the officer wasn't quite ready to back down. He wasn't quite ready to let Marcus go. "What are you waiting for?" The officer spat, his voice still laced with anger, though it wavered now. Marcus could see it in his eyes, the frustration, the panic. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, and it was beginning to eat away at him. Marcus could feel the power shift, but it was only temporary. He knew the officer could snap back at any moment. He wasn't out of danger yet. "You need to leave me alone," Marcus said, his voice calm and measured despite everything inside him, screaming to do something else. He wasn't going to let fear control him anymore. He wasn't going to let this officer intimidate him into submission. But he also knew he had to be careful. The crowd had become more vocal now, shouting words of support for Marcus, urging him to stand his ground. But there was still a palpable tension in the air, one that was ready to explode at any moment. The officer stood there for a moment, his eyes darting around the scene as if looking for an escape or a way to regain his dominance. But Marcus wasn't going to give it to him. He wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of cowering or walking away in fear. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, their energy fueling him, giving him strength he hadn't known he had. "You don't have the right to do this," Marcus said, his voice steady, louder, now the words cutting through the air like a blade. The officer's hand twitched again, as if he were about to reach for something. Marcus braced himself, but then the officer's movements slowed, his hand falling back to his side. As his gaze shifted to the people around him, he knew the situation was spiraling out of his control, and in that moment Marcus could see it, the officer's sense of power slipping away. The tension that had been building for so long began to crack under the weight of the moment. The officer's face softened just slightly as he looked at Marcus. Then he glanced back at the bystanders who were still recording everything. One of them stepped forward and shouted, "Let him go." The officer shifted his gaze again, his eyes now moving from Marcus to the crowd to the recording phones, and then back to Marcus. His posture was stiff, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his stance, and Marcus could feel the shift in the officer's demeanor. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Marcus feel like he had a chance. The officer let out a sharp breath, his hands shaking as he stood there, unsure of what to do next. Marcus wasn't sure what was going to happen next either, but he didn't break his gaze. He didn't back down, even though the officer's actions were unpredictable. He knew he couldn't give him any room to take control again. Not now, not after everything that had happened. And then the officer did something unexpected. He stepped back just a few inches, his eyes still locked on Marcus, but there was no aggression in his posture now, no sign of the anger that had been there just moments before. Marcus could see the moment of realization hit the officer. He understood that he was no longer in control of the situation, that everything had changed, that the crowd was not going to let him get away with what he had done. Marcus stood there, his heart still pounding in his chest, his body tense and ready for whatever might come next. But for the first time since the officer had stopped him, he felt a shift in the air, a sense that the power had shifted in his favor, and the officer knew it too. The officer took another step back, his body tense, but now there was a noticeable shift in his eyes. They weren't as wild as before, they weren't full of rage. They were filled with something else, something Marcus couldn't quite place. But it wasn't anger, it wasn't authority, it was hesitation. The officer's chest still rose and fell quickly, but his gaze was now focused on the crowd around him, the people who had gathered the phones that were capturing everything. Marcus didn't take his eyes off the officer. His heart was still racing, but his body stood firm. His mind kept replaying the moment the officer had struck him. The pain still throbbed in his jaw, but it was starting to fade now. It was no longer about the physical pain, it was about the principle. It was about not allowing himself to be treated like an animal, to be controlled with force because of the color of his skin. The officer swallowed hard, his hands were trembling slightly, but he didn't make any more moves to grab Marcus or even raise his fist. The tension was thick in the air, like the calm before a storm. But Marcus didn't move, he didn't lower his gaze. He stood tall despite everything, knowing that the moment was not over yet. He had to see it through. Somebody shouted from the crowd again, "You need to walk away now, let him go." But the officer didn't respond. He was silent for a moment as his eyes flicked to the people around him, to their phones, to their watchful gazes. He could feel the weight of their stares, the judgment, the pressure to do what was right. But he didn't seem to know what that was anymore. He had been trained to act with authority, to control and dominate. But now he was faced with a situation that was outside of his training, outside of his comfort zone, and it was beginning to crack his resolve. Marcus could feel it. He could feel the officer's strength weakening the longer they stood there in the silence. The longer the crowd watched, the officer's authority had started to slip away. And Marcus knew it. The officer was no longer the one in control of the situation. He had lost that power when he had struck Marcus. But it wasn't just the punch that had taken away his power. It was the realization that his actions were now being held accountable by a community that wasn't going to let him get away with it. The officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his jaw clenched as he glanced around at the crowd. It was clear he was considering his next move. But Marcus wasn't giving him the chance to make a decision on his own. He had already decided what was right, what was just. He had already chosen not to back down no matter what the officer did next. And then, in a moment of pure vulnerability, the officer did something that no one had expected. He lowered his head just slightly, and his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the situation had finally settled in on him. He looked from Marcus to the people watching, and then back to Marcus, his expression softening just enough that Marcus could see the hint of uncertainty there. It was a flicker of doubt, but it was there, and for the first time since this began, Marcus felt a strange sense of power, not from the officer, but from within himself. "I'm sorry," the officer muttered, barely audible over the noise of the crowd. Marcus's brow furrowed in disbelief. Did he really just say that? Did the officer actually say he was sorry? Marcus had been expecting a fight. He had been expecting more anger, more violence. But instead there was something else, something fragile in the officer's voice. Something that caught Marcus off guard. The officer looked up at Marcus, his eyes searching his face, as if hoping for some kind of sign that this apology would be accepted, but Marcus didn't know how to react. He didn't know what to say or how to respond, because in that moment he realized something. It wasn't about what the officer said, it wasn't about his apology, it was about what had just happened, the shift, the change, the fact that for once someone who had held power was now admitting that they had been wrong, that they had lost control. The crowd was silent now. They were watching the officer and Marcus, waiting for the next move, waiting for the next moment to unfold. And as Marcus stood there with the officer's words hanging in the air, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of justice, something that had been lacking in so many moments before, something that told him maybe, just maybe, things could change. The officer's words lingered in the air like a heavy fog, his apology hanging between them, uncertain and raw. Marcus stood still, his mind racing. He didn't know how to react to this. His whole life he had been taught to expect aggression, to expect resistance. But now here was this officer who had just moments ago tried to overpower him. And now he was apologizing. It didn't make sense. Marcus couldn't decide if it was genuine or if it was just a last-ditch effort to avoid further escalation. But either way, he wasn't going to let his guard down. The crowd had gone silent, too, watching, waiting for the next move from both of them. There was a strange tension in the air. Now it was no longer just about the officer and Marcus. It was about what they represented. It was about the dynamic of power and who had the right to hold it, and how much of it could be taken away by the force of a single moment. Marcus took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling slowly as he thought about his next words. The officer was standing before him, clearly conflicted, but Marcus knew that this was not the moment to show weakness. This was the moment to hold his ground, to make sure that his voice was heard loud and clear. "You don't get to just walk away from this," he said, his voice calm but firm, his eyes never leaving the officer's. Marcus could see the officer's shoulders slump as if he were waiting for some kind of forgiveness. But Marcus didn't have any to offer, not yet. He wasn't ready to just let it go, because the apology wasn't enough. It wasn't going to erase what had happened. It wasn't going to fix the way the officer had treated him, or the fear he had felt when the officer's fist had landed on his face. The officer's eyes flickered with something. He wasn't used to vulnerability, maybe, or guilt. It wasn't something Marcus had expected to see from him, but it was there. Marcus could feel it. But that didn't change the fact that the officer had crossed a line that couldn't just be erased with words. "What you did to me isn't right," Marcus continued, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "I don't care if you're sorry. That doesn't change what happened. That doesn't change the fact that you put your hands on me for no reason." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in as the officer stood silently in front of him, his face unreadable. The crowd was still watching, the phone still recording every moment. It was as if the world had come to a stop for a moment, and Marcus realized that this was bigger than just him. It was bigger than just this officer. It was about standing up. It was about making sure that things didn't go back to the way they were before. The officer opened his mouth as if to say something, but then stopped as if he didn't know how to respond. He glanced over at the crowd, and then back at Marcus, and in that moment it was clear to both of them that something had shifted, that the power dynamic between them had changed in an instant. "It's not enough," the officer finally said, his voice quiet and uncertain. But there was something different about it. There was no more bluster, no more authority, just a man who had been caught in a moment of weakness, and who was now trying to figure out how to make it right. Marcus didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't sure what it meant, but he could feel the difference in the air. He could feel that the officer wasn't the same person he had been just a few minutes ago. and for some reason that made Marcus feel even more powerful. The crowd was still silent, but the tension had shifted now. It wasn't just about the officer and Marcus. It was about the bigger picture, about the people who had come together to witness this moment, about the people who had watched everything unfold. It was as if the officer's apology wasn't just for Marcus. It was for all of them, for everyone who had ever been wronged by someone in a position of power. Marcus didn't know if the officer was truly sorry, or if it was just a moment of realization. But whatever it was something he had never expected, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel a sense of victory, not because of the officer's apology, but because of the power of standing up against injustice. Even when the odds were stacked against him, even when the fear of retribution loomed over him, he had found his voice, and that voice had made a difference. The silence that hung in the air was thick. It wasn't the silence of tension or waiting, but the silence of reflection, as if the world had paused for just a moment to let everyone take in what had just happened. The officer stood there, his shoulders slumped, his hands still trembling by his sides. Marcus could see the weight of everything pressing down on him. The crowd was still watching, still recording, and in that moment, Marcus knew something had shifted, something profound had taken place. The officer was no longer the one with the power. He had lost that when he swung his fist and hit Marcus, but the real power wasn't in the officer's hands. It was in the collective strength of the crowd, the voices of those who had witnessed this act and who had refused to stay silent. The officer's gaze met Marcus again, and for the first time since the altercation began, there was no animosity there, no challenge, just a moment of shared understanding. Marcus could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, their support, their energy fueling him, making him stand taller despite the exhaustion that was creeping into his bones. He wasn't just standing for himself anymore. He was standing for everyone who had ever been in this position, everyone who had ever been silenced or dismissed for speaking up. "Are you going to walk away now?" Marcus asked, breaking the silence, his voice calm but powerful. It cut through the tension like a knife. The officer blinked as if waking from a trance. He didn't respond immediately, but his eyes dropped to the ground, as if he couldn't look at Marcus anymore. His face flushed with shame. Marcus could feel the officer's internal struggle. He could feel the apology hanging there, but it was not enough to undo the damage done. It wasn't enough to make everything right. "I'm not going anywhere," the officer muttered after a long pause, his voice small, barely audible. Marcus took a step back and nodded as if acknowledging that the officer's words held some weight, but it wasn't a complete resolution. The damage had been done, and Marcus knew that this moment would not be the end of it. It couldn't be, because the real work was just beginning. The real change would come from everyone in that crowd, from all the voices who had stood up and said enough was enough. The officer stood there for a few more moments, unsure of what to do next, unsure of whether he should speak again or just walk away. But the moment had already passed. There was no going back. The crowd began to murmur again. Some spoke loudly, urging the officer to leave. Others stayed silent. But all of them seemed to share a common understanding. They had witnessed something real, something raw and powerful, and they would not forget it. Marcus turned his attention back to the crowd. As his thoughts swirled, he had won this small battle, but the war was far from over. It wasn't just about one officer or one interaction. It was about the bigger picture. It was about the system that allowed these things to happen, and the people who stood by and did nothing. But today something had shifted. He had stood up, and for the first time he had been heard. He had felt the power of his own voice and the strength of his own resilience. He had not been intimidated. He had not been broken, and neither had the crowd who stood with him. The officer finally turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy as he disappeared into the distance, and for a moment it felt like the weight had been lifted. The tension in the air began to dissipate and the crowd slowly started to disperse. But the energy remained. It lingered in the air, like an echo of something powerful that had just been unleashed. Marcus stood there for a moment longer, letting it all settle in. He had made it through, and he had made a difference. But the fight was far from over. He knew that this was only the beginning. As he walked away, his head held high, he knew he had done something that mattered, something that would ripple out into the world, something that would inspire others to stand up when they saw injustice, something that would remind everyone that no matter how small the moment, no matter how quiet the voice, it could change everything.